A Flash Outside the Off Stump, Episode 12, The Playboy Prince. The death of Queen Victoria in January 1901 marked the end of an era. England was deeply divided between rich and poor, and despite being at the heart of one of the largest and wealthiest empires the world had ever known, her cities were home to extensive slums filled with destitute people. At this end of the social scale, life was hard. Disease, infant mortality, alcoholism, crime and prostitution were rife. On the back of this social turmoil, prejudice was common. The poor were demonised as a vicious semi-criminal underclass, with the immigrant communities of the Jews and Irish being particularly singled out as causes for concern. Where working people attempted to better their lot via working men's institutes, trades unions and the labour movement, they met with a mixed reaction. The more liberal-minded members of the establishment welcomed these moves, but others worried that they were a precursor to the kind of revolutionary activities which they saw as all too common on the continent. For many of the well-to-do, the Edwardian period ushered in an era of hedonism not known since Regency times, almost 100 years earlier. The new king was determined to enjoy himself after a lifetime in his august mother's shadow, and many in the smart set were happy to follow his lead. The Edwardian era happily coincided with an expansion in new technology for those that could afford it, enabling them to have motor cars, telephones and electric light. Improvements to the rail network and the expansion of steam shipping also meant that travel was faster, more reliable and more luxurious than ever before. For those who moved in the same circles as Ranji, this was truly set to be a golden age. Ranji himself started the new era sleeping in the corridor of a third-class hotel. He had interrupted his normal winter round of shooting and fishing weekends to attend the Queen's funeral procession, bringing two daughters of his old guardian, the Reverend Borissow, with him to London. Finding accommodation limited, he had gallantly found a room for the ladies and slept outside. Ranji was very attached to the Borissows, but had a particularly close relationship with the eldest daughter, Edith, to whom he eventually became engaged, at least unofficially. Unfortunately, this was a time in which mixed marriages were viewed unfavourably, and Ranji and Edith's engagement was destined to be both long and ultimately unfulfilled. The Reverend Borissow reportedly had concerns both about mixed relationships in general and Ranji's precarious financial state in particular. While not apparently forbidding the match outright, he effectively indefinitely postponed it by requesting that they wait until they were absolutely sure it was the right thing to do. From Ranji's position, a mixed marriage certainly risked offending some of the princes upon whose support he was relying to one day secure the throne of Nawanagar, as well as causing some disquiet amongst the British authorities in India. However, in the early 1900s, Ranji may have swung between sometimes thinking he might never become Jam Sahib, in which case his choice of marriage partner was nobody else's business, and other times assuming that once he had become Jam Sahib, he would be in a position to please himself. After the Queen's funeral, Ranji returned to the shooting and fishing circuit for the rest of the winter and early spring. He very much enjoyed living the life of an English gentleman, but it was an expensive business, and he was unfortunately living well beyond his means. His creditors were beginning to get agitated, and in the early years of the new decade his finances were to come under increasing scrutiny, and his attitude to spending and debt began to seriously threaten the popular reputation he had so carefully created. Court cases and summonses over unpaid bills were to become increasingly common occurrences for Ranji over the next few years, so much so that Archie McLaren, Ranji's colleague from the England team, who he had engaged as his personal secretary, found that his cricket sometimes had to take a back seat to sorting out Ranji's legal and financial problems, which were soon to raise their head in spectacular fashion. On one of his shooting trips in early spring 1901, Ranji was laid low with flu. Always afflicted with chest problems, he was out of action for several weeks, and it was almost the end of May before he played his first cricket of the year. He made a steady rather than spectacular start to the season, warming up in July and August to post some excellent scores, including 170 not out against Lancashire at Old Trafford, 219 at Hove, and 285 not out against Somerset at Taunton. The innings at Taunton became the stuff of legend. Ranji had been criticised in some quarters for his off-the-field behaviour during the cricket season, with some feeling that his penchant for dinner parties and late-night bridge and billiards sessions was not conducive to bringing out the best in his play on the field. Sometime later, C.B. Fry wrote of this particular incident that Tyler and Woods of the Somerset team, knowing of Ranji's passion for fishing, told him of an excellent night fishing spot at a nearby mill pond, in the hope that he would stay up fishing all night and be no use for batting the next day. Getting wind of this, Billy Murdoch, the Sussex captain, absolutely forbade Ranji to leave the hotel at night. But Ranji sneaked out anyway, leaving his shoes outside his bedroom door for polishing, to give the impression that he was asleep. He spent the whole night rod in hand and still turned in a massive performance the next day. There may be some truth to the story, but Murdoch wasn't Sussex captain in 1901, and Tyler and Woods didn't play in that particular match. Fry may have taken events from another season and attached it to that match to make a good story, or simply made it up to give Ranji some relief from his critics. On the whole, 1901 turned out to be a very good year domestically for Ranji. Sussex, although still weak in bowling, were now a batting force to be reckoned with. Fry at one point scoring 6 centuries in succession, and the team finished 4th in the county championship. Many teams were now wise to Ranji's mastery of the leg glance and positioned their fielders accordingly, but Ranji merely adapted his style of play, and the 1901 season was notable for the number of runs he scored from drives. Ranji spent the following winter in Saradar, but was back in Sussex for the beginning of the 1902 season. The summer was notable for being one of the wettest on record, which in the days before the kind of sophisticated covers available to the modern first-class game, resulted in a number of challenging, sticky wickets, and an above-average number of drawn games. Sussex, despite the absence of Ranji and Fry for many games, managed to rise to 2nd in the championship. Elsewhere, the grand old man of the game, W.G. Grace, made a number of centuries to take him past the 200 mark at the advanced age of 54. For Ranji, 1902 was a very curious season, and his form was erratic. In some games the old magic was there, and he made some superb centuries in his county matches. However, he also had some very bad innings, particularly in the Test series against the visiting Australians. He was picked for the first 4 Tests, although in the event he was unable to play in the 3rd. The Edgbaston and Lord's Tests were pretty much washouts, but Ranji only made 13 in Birmingham, and was out for a duck in London. At Old Trafford he batted in both innings, making 2 in the first and another duck in the second. His Sussex teammate Fry, also in the England line-up for the opening 2 Tests, had a similarly torrid time, with scores of 0, 0, 1 and 4. Ranji's performances in the Tests were poor, but the weather meant that they were all pretty low-scoring affairs. Furthermore, there were some mitigating factors. In the first Test, Ranji hadn't really settled down after a misunderstanding had resulted in his running out his friend Archie McLaren. In the second Test, he was controversially given out LBW in very bad light. Nevertheless, the selectors were unforgiving, and he was never picked for England again. The Test career, which had begun so promisingly just a few years before, was over. It is quite surprising at first glance that he was never given another chance. Despite failing in the Tests, he still finished 2nd in the first-class averages that year, scoring 230 against Essex, and 135 and 234 not out against Surrey. Even though he didn't come up to snuff in the Tests, he managed reasonable scores against the Australians playing for the MCC at both Lord's and the Oval. So was there some sinister hand at play? Why was Ranji not picked again? The answer probably lies in the fact that events off the field overtook Ranji's cricketing career. The twin concerns of his finances and the political situation in India, both of which may have contributed to his erratic form in the early part of the season, conspired to bring his play for 1902 to an early conclusion. He played for Sussex against the Australians at Hove in the first weekend of August, and then disappeared from view. His absence was noted. He was, after all, Sussex's star attraction, although they managed to do quite well without him for the last few weeks of the season. The press was full of rumours concerning the reasons for his absence and whether it was to be permanent. Some claimed that there was friction between Ranji and some of the Sussex professionals, but no definitive evidence of this has come to light. We do know that Ranji was entertaining a party of friends and family from India over that summer. They had come for the coronation of Edward VII, and then stayed on for longer than expected when it was temporarily postponed due to the king's ill health. As per usual, Ranji treated his guests magnificently and was an attentive host, laying on top-notch accommodation and entertainment, but he was scarcely in a position to afford this, and the extended nature of his guest stay stretched his already strained financial position to breaking point and beyond. For the end of the summer he went to Gilling in Yorkshire, where the Reverend Borissow was now rector. Here he could lie low with his adopted family, free from the temptations of city life and high society. He stayed in Gilling until the start of the following season. The summer of 1903 was even wetter than the previous one. With no touring Australians and his creditors temporarily satisfied, Ranji returned to Sussex and threw himself back into county cricket. That spring, the young new Jam Sahib had been installed at Jamnagar, and with little prospect of now ascending to the Gadi of Nawanagar himself, Ranji was more single-minded about his cricket. Once again, he proved a formidable batting partnership with Fry, and the pair topped the averages for the season, with Sussex once again coming second in the championship. After wintering in India, where he went lion shooting in Gujarat and was almost killed by a panther, Ranji returned to England for the 1904 season. Fry took over the captaincy of Sussex, but Ranji played a full season for them, topping the English averages at the end of the year with 2,077 runs at an average of 74. Fry was second in the averages with 70.6, but scored across a much larger total of 2,824 runs. The weather in 1904 was a vast improvement over the previous 2 years. The sun shone, and there were long hot days that afforded plenty of opportunities to score runs, and Ranji and Fry obliged. Early in the season at Lord's, Ranji had scored 166 not out against Cambridge and 142 against Oxford in the same week. Lord's also saw him make 178 for the MCC against the South Africans and 121 for the Gentlemen against the Players. It was also a season in which Ranji and Fry had some of their greatest partnerships at the wicket, putting on 255 against Yorkshire at Sheffield before playing a splendid innings against Surrey, in which Fry made 181 and Ranji 152. In August, Ranji treated the home crowd at Hove to a masterly display of batting against Lancashire, scoring 99 in the first innings and 207 not out in the second. It appeared that Ranji had hit a very rich vein of form indeed, and it may well have been that this would have continued if outside events hadn't have taken an unexpected turn. As it happened, the summer of 1904 was Ranji's last as a regular Sussex player. He would return again in 1908, 1912, and as a rather sad postscript in 1920, but would never again display the magical form of the 1904 season. In November of 1904, Ranji sailed for India, seemingly with the same intention as the previous year, of paying visits to friends and relatives in Gujarat and hunting some big game before returning to Hove in time for the opening games of the 1905 season. Indeed, with a young and healthy Jam Sahib in Jamnagar, there seemed to be little reason to suspect that he would be detained in India beyond the spring. However, the previous year, Ranji had consulted his Joshi, or astrologer, Pandit Hareshwar, who had read his palm, and consulted his astrological charts, and given the following surprising and confident verdict.
If you do not sit on the Gadi of Nawanagar on the 11th of March 1907, I will give 2,000 rupees to charity and give up my work.
Given the youth and seemingly good health of the current incumbent of the Gadi, it seemed a rash prediction. However, in the summer of 1906, the young Jam Sahib was struck down with typhoid. He struggled on for a few weeks before dying at the tender age of 24, having failed to provide an heir despite having no less than 5 young wives. It seemed that Ranji might, after all, fulfill Pandit Hareshwar's prediction. There were, of course, rumours of foul play. The court at Jamnagar had a very long history of skullduggery and intrigue, and few successions had been entirely unchallenged, and many had been accompanied by accusations of poisonings and assassination. This time was to be no different, and the hand of Ranji's agents or supporters were held by many to be behind the Jam Sahib's untimely death, although most of these voices stopped short of accusing Ranji of direct involvement. Interestingly, the British Resonance Office in Rajkot had already investigated 2 earlier plots to assassinate Jasaji, the previous Jam Sahib, in which Ranji was at least partially implicated, in April 1902 and again in April 1903. Despite this, the British establishment in India were well disposed to Ranji as a candidate for the throne, particularly given the corruption and mismanagement of the previous incumbent. Ranji was considered to be the next best thing to having an actual Englishman on the Gadi of Nawanagar, having been educated in an English manner and having spent the last decade or more living the life of an English gentleman. However, there were certain political and administrative niceties to be observed before he could ascend to the position of Jam Sahib, and there was also a scandal to be resolved. In April of 1904, Ranji had persuaded his old school friend Mansur Kachar to lend him the enormous sum of £10,000. In return, Ranji promised to talk to the Viceroy of India, Lord Curzon, about Mansur Kachar's claim to the throne of Jazdan. Ranji was travelling back to England on the same ship as Curzon, which he claimed would give him plenty of time to persuade him of the merits of Mansur's case. Ranji certainly did have some conversations with Curzon, both at sea and later at a Sussex versus Derbyshire fixture, but what they talked about is unknown. On Ranji's previous winter trip to India, he had become an agent for the Lanchester Motor Company. Ranji was particularly fond of cars, and had apparently persuaded Lanchester to make him their Indian agent. They furnished him with a car to take to India, and he promised to try and secure orders for more from his aristocratic acquaintances across the north of the country. By the beginning of 1905, it was becoming clear to Mansur that Ranji had little or no influence with Curzon, and he began agitating for the return of his money. For his part, Ranji, always heavily indebted, was probably no longer in possession of the money, and tried instead to persuade Mansur to buy his position as Lanchester agent for India. He produced an impressive list of sales to bolster his case, but unfortunately many of the names on the list were mutual acquaintances, and Mansur was quickly able to ascertain that many, if not all, of the sales were bogus. Unsurprisingly, he immediately filed a suit in the Bombay High Court for the return of his £10,000. Ranji would be unable to leave India and return to English cricket until this matter had been resolved. It was temporarily solved by the death of Jasaji. Ranji was apparently able to persuade Mansur that he needed him to drop the case so that he could become Jam Sahib, and that once he was in control of Nawanagar, he would have access to enough funds to repay the £10,000 debt with interest. Mansur did drop the case, and Ranji thanked him. But after his accession, no money was forthcoming. As Jam Sahib, Ranji now had more expenses than ever, and the revenues of his small and impoverished state were severely stretched. When he finally returned to England in 1908, it was with the added glamour of being a cricketing ruler, and the crowds would flock to watch him play. But Mansur was not far behind him, and the saga of Ranji's debt was now to be played out at the heart of the British establishment.